Edmund Morris is here. In 1979, he published the first of a projected 3-volume biography of Theodore Roosevelt. The book earned him both the Pulitzer Prize and the American Book Award. Now, more than 20 years later, he has written the next installment, Theodore Rex. This volume covers Roosevelt's 7.5 years in the White House. The New Yorker says that the book, quote, gives us a new way of thinking about Roosevelt. I'm pleased to have Edmund Morris back at this table. Welcome.
Thank you, Charlie.
Listen to this. This is from you, Morris on Roosevelt. He has been a published author at 18, a husband at 22, an acclaimed historian in New York State Assemblyman at 23, a father and a widow at 25, ranchman at 26, a candidate for mayor of New York at 27, a husband again at 28, a civil service commissioner of the United States at 30. By then he was producing book after book and child after child and cultivating every scientist, politician, artist, and intellectual of repute in Washington. His career had gathered further speed, police commissioner of New York at 36, assistant secretary of the Navy at 38, colonel of the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, the Rough Riders, at 39. At last in Cuba had come the consummating crowded hour. A rush, a roar, the sting of his own blood, a surge towards the sky, smoking pistol in his hand, a soldier in light blue doubling up nearly as a jackrabbit. When the smoke cleared, he had found himself atop Kettle Hill on the heights of San Juan with a vanquished empire at his feet. That's your guy.
Great articulation, Charlie.
Yeah.
You should do Gilbert and Sullivan Patter's songs.
Not bad at first glance, but it is a sense, an amazing sense of a young man in a hurry.
And a young man who's really a faster moving person than anybody in his ambit. He just moved faster and thought faster and acted more quickly than anybody. So he seemed to be impulsive because of this speed. But it was actually a very careful mechanism behind the speed. He thought everything out. He was just that much quicker.
Okay, driven by what?
I don't know, whatever mysterious force drives men of this quality. I mean, he had a terrible physical mechanism to begin with. You know, at the age of, when he was an infant, doctors said he wouldn't last beyond his 3rd birthday. And even when he left Harvard, the doctor there said to him, if you continue living at this pace, you're going to die. You're going to have to live a sedentary life of scholarship, otherwise your life is going to be short. So he said, Doctor, I'm going to do everything you told me not to. I'm going to live life to the hilt until I'm 60, and then I'm going to die. And guess what? That's what he did.
Died at 60. What was the illness? I've forgotten the...
What killed him?
Yeah.
Cholera morbus. Cholera morbus actually was a lifelong thing he had with his intestines, but the actual physical cause of death was a pulmonary embolism.
He is in the ferment of political activists and those who had an intellectual bent. Where?
I would put his intellect at the very top. I would put it right up there with Jefferson's. I mean, he was just as Catholic in his interests, if not more so, and certainly much more of a man of action, physical action, than Jefferson. We must remember he was a war hero. He was a colonel who had commanded his regiment. He was also an intellectual of the first quality who had written many books, biography, history, political commentary, hunting books, ornithology, and 150,000 letters, plus all those jobs that you were reciting just now. And the intellect shows up in the quality of his erudition as president. He read on average a book a day, even when he was president.
A book a day?
1 book a day on average, sometimes 3. There's an actual anecdote of Owen Wister, his old friend, the novelist, going to the White House for dinner one night and recommending a book to the president, which the president took upstairs at 10:30 that night. And he came down for breakfast next morning at 8 o'clock and proceeded to recite whole sections of it by memory. He photographed what he read.
Photographic memory, no question.
No question. And as Wister said, somehow between his dinner and his sleep and his breakfast, he'd read a volume of 350 pages and missed nothing of significance that it contained.
But that's an amazing rate of reading, isn't it?
It is. He was, I suppose,
Did he sleep?
a natural speed reader.
Yeah.
He slept with as much energy as he went through the day.
Yeah.
He slept almost cataleptically. And the point I'm trying to make about the depth of his mind, the quality of his intellect, is that in diplomatic confrontations, he'd read so much, he understood so much, in 4 languages, that he could understand foreign sensibilities. When dealing with the Ottoman Empire, he knew about the history of Turkey. He knew about the history of Islam. He was deeply versed in the history of Russia when he negotiated the end to the Russo-Japanese War, and also Japan.
When you sit across from people at any table, in negotiation, in conversation, if you show some curiosity, plus information, plus intellect, plus insight into the world of the other person, you are on your way to
Absolutely.
some kind of engagement.
Right.
And
right.
he had that in spades when he walked in.
Yes. It's sometimes said that he was not a very good reader of human character, but I'm not sure if I believe that anymore. He tended to like everybody he met. He had that political weakness.
Yeah.
And
because he wanted them to like him, or did we know?
He was just by nature overwhelmingly positive. He was like Ronald Reagan, who loved everybody he met, and he couldn't understand why people would detest him. Roosevelt was like that too, and he also relied, as Reagan did, on his wife to temper this natural ebullience, this tendency to like everybody. So he relied on Edith Kermit Roosevelt a lot.
Go ahead.
But I was just going to say that despite the fact that he tended to like the people he met, he was also wise. Wisdom comes from reading. Wisdom comes from deep knowledge. He was therefore sensitive to the feelings of other people and other countries. Plus, he was also adept at working out his strategy on the base of this universal knowledge.
Would he was a young man when he came to the White House. I guess the youngest at 42 he came to the White House. Right. Kennedy came at 43, but had been elected at 42, do I remember?
He was the youngest elected president, and TR was the youngest president.
He was 42 because he came on the assassination. How do you explain the fact that his political maneuverings that led him to switch parties and do all that kind of thing? Was it simply because he lost because he wanted power so much? Yes,
he did. One of the greatest things he did was to give up power when he was really in flush with it. At the age of 48, he was offered a third term in the White House, and he could have had it on a silver plate. But he began to detect in himself the slight corruption that power can bring. And he said very honorably that he thought that George Washington had established a precedent whereby 2 terms is enough for any man. So he gave up the White House and left it at the early age of 50, a noble gesture, because he was born to exert power. He loved it there. However, he gave it up, but then he began to regret giving it up. So he came back in 1912, trying to get the Republican nomination for another term in the White House, was denied the nomination, therefore formed a third party, the Progressive Party, and campaigned on that ticket.
So it was ambition.
It was ambition and also frustration with his successor. It's the familiar story of a great man handpicking a successor, and then within months becoming impatient with him and wanting to do it again himself.
The need for the physical need to exert himself, to prove himself, psychologically, I assume, in part comes from the weakness as a child.
I think so, yes. It's difficult to psychoanalyze men of this quality.
Why is that?
Well, should I say it's easy to, but I don't think it's very satisfying.
Yeah, right.
And I don't much like psychobiography myself. I think that action reveals itself through character and vice versa. And if I write a biography telling what this man did and how he did it, I think the sheer facts of his life speak for themselves. He was a phenomenon.
When you came back to him after the Reagan experience and book, I mean, did you see him in any way differently because you had been in the White House so close and watched it?
That's a good question. It was indeed a good thing that I did do the Reagan book, because when I went back to TR's White House, I had recognized so many things that are eternally true of the White House that I'd never understood before. How the president works, the power of personal charm, how that can be used, how the press is manipulated, how the president, in his demeanor, in his personal body, embodies the dignity of the United States. All these things.
Reagan understood that.
Which Reagan understood instinctively. I saw operating with Theodore Roosevelt too.
He seemed to have understood, it seemed to me, by the nature of his character, by the flamboyance of his character, by the sense of, I am a man of courage, and I am a man of action. He wanted that, he understood the power of that, however genuine it was. He understood the power of that as an attractive aspect of personality and an essential ingredient of leadership.
Right. Yes, I think you're quite right. The courage that you refer to, the bravery that he seemed to discharge like electric pulsations, was actually an act of will. He said very frankly in his own autobiography, I was not born courageous. My courage is not a natural inheritance. I had to make myself brave simply by practicing bravery.
How do you practice bravery?
One behaves bravely. One forces oneself as a teenager, you know, to swim in ice-choked rivers and go off into the wilderness alone and build up one's body.
This is the way they train Navy SEALs and people like that today.
Indeed.
You know, it's exact, by throwing them into adverse elements.
Yeah.
And say, this is the way you will be challenged, because it prepares you for a real challenge.
See what your capabilities are.
Yeah.
He's constantly extending his capabilities.
I am fascinated by this aspect of human beings. Those, George Patton is an example. I'm not sure if there's a similarity at all. People who imagine they are and become so.
Right. You will yourself to be.
Yeah.
Yeah. The will is the most remarkable thing about Theodore Roosevelt. This giant will that built up that big, beefy, brawny body we know so well from very unprepossessing beginnings, and which superimposed itself politically on Congress, on the American people, on the whole world. He became the first president who's ever become a world figure. In fact, the only president who's ever mediated the end of a foreign war at the invitation of the contending parties.
He also introduced America in a real way to a new century. Don't you think?
Yes, it's one of those mysterious concatenations of fate that he should become president, so young and lusty, in 1901 through an act of assassination, just when the United States itself was becoming a world power. And he had all the intellectual and cultural and political equipment to make it a world power, which he promptly did.
Which is the other aspect of, on the one hand, willing to be, you know, and willing to have, and at the same time, and we see today with the present president, the sense of you are, in the end, as well as you bring your own personality to make a difference, you are also either lucky or not lucky by circumstances that give you an opportunity to perform, an opportunity to bring to bear whatever skills you have. And the timeliness of what he coming to power at the time probably made him, in the end, a great man.
Yes, I think his luck was also an aspect of his will. It somehow seems that men that positive, that driving, create their own luck.
Yeah.
I mean, Reagan was famously lucky. Roosevelt was famously lucky, but was their luck entirely happenstance, or was it brought about by sheer positive force? I think that.
Yeah, being prepared to take advantage of the opportunity given you by luck.
Right, that's where his quickness helped him.
Yeah.
He's always prepared and always quick to jump.
As a historian, just talk a minute about George Bush, the 43rd president, as an element of this factor. What do you see when you look at him from the perspective of someone who has known personally and through scholarship another president?
Well, I see Bush to be rather like TR in the sense that he was misjudged when he first became president. He was considered untried. TR did have formidable experience, but he was so young that Republican conservatives thought that he was going to have to be looked after. And it took him about 24 or maybe 36 hours to disabuse them of that. He had become president through an act of terrorism, and George Bush had to prove himself through an act of terrorism, which occurred almost exactly 100 years after the assassination of McKinley. And in both cases, the crisis, the national trauma that the assassination brought in 1901 and World Trade Center this time, tempered the man and gave us a president immeasurably stronger than we imagined when he came into office.
The opportunity and the crisis builds character, or I don't know what the opposite of that is. I mean, I don't know who people who collapse in the face of challenge. I don't know where history's measurement of that is.
Well, the opposite of that is when the president has nothing essentially to do that calls upon his qualities.
Right. But I'm saying the reverse of that. I'm saying that if TR had been no good, what would have been different? I mean, or if George Bush had not been surrounded, had certain qualities that while immature, this gave opportunity to. What if he hadn't had those qualities? I mean, how would the world be different?
Oh, I'm not comfortable with what-if questions because, you know, they're just luxurious speculations. One observes what happened and what was done. Theodore Roosevelt revived the national spirit within a matter of weeks of coming to the presidency. Force
of his personality and the desire of a nation to be led.
Yes, yes. The desire of the nation to see something positive operating at the highest level. And George Bush did exactly the same. Having said that, there are obvious differences. I mean, Bush is by no means an intellectual, as TR was. I don't think he reads much, and I don't think he's particularly interested in learning more than he does know already. Theodore Roosevelt was insatiably curious and wanted to learn more and more and more as he proceeded through office. So his presidency got richer and richer, and his character got deeper.
Take a look at this clip. This is from the American Experience, the story of Theodore Roosevelt. Take a look. This is a PBS program that was seen some time ago. Here it is.
Less than 7 months after his inauguration, President William McKinley was dead from an assassin's bullet. 5 days of mourning were led by the new president, Theodore Roosevelt. The worst fears of the Republican establishment had come to pass. The whole country was in mourning, a reporter remembered, and no doubt the president felt that he should hold himself down. But his joy showed in every word and movement. He strode to the office on his first day, September 22nd, 1901, a torrent of energy, moving quickly to make the presidency his own. It is a dreadful thing to come in this way, Roosevelt wrote a friend, but it would be a far worse thing to be morbid about it.
Does it make a difference that you admire and like him in terms of the quality of a biography?
I'm not in love with him. I'm not a sucker for him.
No, I didn't say any of those things. Admire and like is different from sucker and in love.
I guess.
Yeah.
Yes, I admire him and I like him. That's true.
And it makes it easier if or not. I mean, would it
it
not
makes
be,
it a lot easier.
It wouldn't be fun if you just sort of detested the guy and found him without courage or morality or integrity or gifts.
I can't imagine anything worse than writing a biography about somebody you dislike, because dislike feeds upon itself, and as the years go by, you begin to detest your subject more and more. A mild affection is the healthiest attitude, I think, and it's very hard not to like TR.
And do you come away with some understanding about human nature from studying so closely and so thoroughly a man's life?
I certainly have come away with an understanding of the American character, which, you know, to an immigrant is a process of self-education. I think one of the reasons I first decided to write about TR was the fact that he was so quintessentially American, and as an immigrant I wanted to learn more and more about my own adopted country, which I've done through studying him so much.
It makes it a lot easier, because you focus a lot on his writings, to understand someone, I mean, to have the benefit of such a voluminous writer.
Yes. Being a writer myself, I naturally identify with his literary side, perhaps more than his political side, since I'm not very political. And he could have been a pretty distinguished writer if he'd chosen to direct his life that way. I mean, his gift of imagery was extraordinary. His humor was delicious. His auditory imagination was amazing, I think deriving from the fact that when he was young he was so myopic. He couldn't relate to the natural world, to birds and animals, except by hearing them. So all his prose, his natural prose, is redolent with sound effects. And as a writer, I really respect and admire that kind of thing.
What was his most glaring flaw?
His most glaring weakness was his strength, if that doesn't sound paradoxical. He got too strong in the presidency for his own good. And as a result of that, he perpetrated an injustice in 1906, which has become the one big blot on his record. And I'm talking about the Brownsville episode.
Tell us about it.
Well, in the summer of 1906, the white citizens of Brownsville, Texas, reported to the president that there had been a riot in their town, and a battalion of black soldiers had killed a white citizen and seriously maimed a white police officer. And would the president, as commander-in-chief, please withdraw this battalion from their community and discipline these men? So the president, after a series of very perfunctory inspections by the army, decided to uphold his inspector general, and he dishonorably discharged every single man in the battalion. Even though the evidence that they had rioted was very skimpy, in fact pretty obviously trumped up. He could never bring himself to admit that what he'd done was wrong, because by then he began to believe that everything he did was right. Since all his intentions were good and his instincts were so correct, he thought he had brought about justice. But he had not.
Delusions of infallibility? Or?
Yeah. And I think that was the sense of that made him turn down another term in the presidency. He began to notice in himself the corrupting effect of being too powerful.
Edmund Morris, this book is called Theodore Rex. Edmund Morris has won a Pulitzer Prize for the first one, called The Rise of Theodore Roosevelt. He goes now, I assume at some point soon, back to the computer or typewriter or longhand, however he does this, to begin or complete Volume 3. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie.
At 27, a husband again at 28, a Civil Service Commissioner of the United States at 30. By then he was producing book after book and child after child and cultivating every scientist, politician, artist, and intellectual of repute in Washington. His career had gathered further speed. Police Commissioner of New York at 36, Assistant Secretary of the Navy at 38, Colonel of the 1st U.S. Volunteer Cavalry, the Rough Riders, at 39. At last in Cuba had come the consummating crowded hour. A rush, a roar, the sting of his own blood, a surge towards the sky, smoking pistol in his hand, a soldier in light blue doubling up nearly as a jackrabbit. When the smoke cleared, he had found himself atop Kettle Hill on the heights of San Juan with a vanquished empire. Edmund Morris is here. In 1979, he published the first of a projected 3-volume biography of Theodore Roosevelt. The book earned him both the Pulitzer Prize and the American Book Award. Now, more than 20 years later, he has written the next installment, Theodore Rex. This volume covers Roosevelt's 7.5 years in the White House. The New Yorker says that the book, quote, gives us a new way of thinking about Roosevelt. I'm pleased to have Edmund Morris back at this table. Welcome.
Thank you, Charlie.
Listen to this. This is from you, Morris on Roosevelt. He has been a published author at 18, a husband at 22, an acclaimed historian in New York State Assemblyman at 23, a father and a widow at 25, ranchman at 26, a candidate for mayor of New York, are at his feet. That's your guy.
Great articulation, Charlie.
Yeah.
You should do Gilbert and Sullivan Patter's songs.
Not bad at first glance, but it is a sense, an amazing sense of a young man in a hurry.
And a young man who's really a faster-moving person than anybody in his ambit. He just moved faster and thought faster and acted more quickly than anybody. So he seemed to be impulsive because of this speed. But it was actually a very careful mechanism behind the speed. He thought everything out. He was just that much quicker.
Okay, driven by what?
I don't know, whatever mysterious force drives men of this quality. I mean, he had a terrible physical mechanism to begin with. You know, at the age of, when he was an infant, doctors said he wouldn't last beyond his 3rd birthday. And even when he left Harvard, the doctor there said to him, if you continue living at this pace, you're going to die. You're going to have to live a sedentary life of scholarship, otherwise your life is going to be short. So he said, Doctor, I'm going to do everything you told me not to. I'm going to live life to the hilt until I'm 60, and then I'm going to die. And guess what? That's what he did.
Died at 60. What was the illness? I've forgotten the...
What killed him?
Yeah.
Cholera morbus. to do, cholera morbus actually was a lifelong thing he had with his intestines, but the actual physical cause of death was a pulmonary embolism.
He is in the ferment of political activists and those who had an intellectual bent. Where?
I would put his intellect at the very top. I would put it right up there with Jefferson's. I mean, he was just as Catholic in his interests, if not more so, and certainly much more of a man of action, physical action, than Jefferson.